Hi everyone, I'd like you to take some notes about MLA documentation integrating quotes, following along with the handout that goes along with this presentation. So there are many different ways to quote and cite in the paper, and I'm teaching you all these different nuances for variety in your writing so that you can introduce these quotes and cite them in various different ways. So the most basic is a parenthetical citation, and what this means is we are giving credentials to this quote using the documentation at the end of the quote in parentheses. And that's where the word parenthetical comes from. So in this case, because we know the author is Ryan Burr, we're giving him the credit because these are his words that we're quoting from. And it's his last name only and the page number if we know it. If we don't know the author, then we use the first two words of the title of the article. If you're working with a website, it would be the first two words of the website title. So these are the different variations, and I'd like you to take a look at them in the handout. Take notes of them of this as well in your notes. Similar to this is InText Citation, but instead of putting the citation at the end of the quote, you're going to introduce the source while you're introducing the quote. So in this case, we're giving credit to the author, or if we don't know the author, it would be the title of the article, the full title, or the full title of the website. So that's what we would be doing here. Okay, and I just want you to kind of pay attention to how this is incorporated into the in-text of introducing that quote. Other ways to get quotes into your paper is to blend a small part of a quote into your sentence, as we see here, still giving the credentials to that author if known, or first two words of the article title or website, whatever the source information dictates. Or we can have a complete sentence to introduce that quote, and we would be separating that with a colon, the complete sentence to the quote. If you needed to delete some information because the quote is too long and you just want maybe the first part of that quote and maybe the last part, then you can use an ellipses to delete some of that information. And you can go back to the handout to look at the original in pink and then see how I changed it up and what words I deleted in the example. Sometimes you might have a quote within a quote where you are quoting a selection from an article that's like interviewing somebody and they're quoting from them. So what's happening here is I'm quoting from the selection I took, copy and pasted from the article, but in that article they have quoted something, and here I have to change that to an apostrophe key that I use for a single quotation mark. This differentiates between the double quote for my copy and paste selection and the single quote mark for the quote mark they used in the article. Man, that's a lot, and I'd like you to rewind this, look at what I'm saying, and look at the handout, look at the original in the article, and compare it to what I had to do to quote it in my paper. A lot going on with quotes within quotes, but you just might encounter it. Another thing you might do is have to paraphrase a quote because it's just too long. So in this case, this would be a pretty long, and I'm paraphrasing it, shortening it, changing up most of the words and vocabulary, but I'm still giving credit to the author or the website or the article if I don't know that author. This is, if you don't do the credentials, it's called plagiarism, folks. If you're changing words of a quote, you're still getting that information from a source, and you still need to document it. So keep that in mind. Okay, another one is sometimes you have to change a word or two in the actual quote because maybe it's too long or a weird defining word or term you'd have to define. Maybe you're trying to put it in layman's terms, or maybe the quote isn't completely a full sentence unless you change some wording to fit it into your introduction of that quote. Either way, I want you to kind of look at the original and what I changed. So in this case, rather than say Facebook or Twitter, I just put social media because maybe I want to cover other things like TikTok and Snapchat. So I changed the wording in brackets. Still keeping the quote marks, still documenting. Now, there are other ways to introduce quotes as well. And in this case, we're using the old Greek method, which is logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos is the logical appeal, and in this case, we're trying to use evidence to convince the audience of a certain point. And here, I'm trying to use the definition of what news sources are versus misinformation by quoting what the definition of news sources are and why we should know the difference between a news source and misinformation. And in this case, stories that are transparent on how they know what they know, like sources that they've gotten that from, that's news, right? Anyone who is a news reporter who's actually on the scene and they're witnessing something and they've done a lot of research on the topic from other sources and they're reporting on that, they're newscasters. They're people who are experts in the field. It's not just someone's opinion. And I'm using this definition to explain why we shouldn't have fear of news sources. Some are biased, but they're not always fake. Really depends on that transparency, and that's what I'm using as my evidence. Pathos is a little different. It's the emotional appeal, and this one might really work for a lot of you because what you're doing is you're creating a word, and in this case, it's the word alarming. It's the emotional appeal of alarming to describe the feeling behind the quote. And I do think it is alarming that some people think that all sources of information are somehow manipulative. And I'm kind of fixing this a little bit, but as you can see, this is the word that's being used, and this is the beginning of the quote. But I'm using the emotional appeal to signal to the readers that this is something that we should pay attention to. It is alarming that people think that news sources are out to manipulate us. It's not always the case. Ethos is the ethical appeal, and this has to do with morals, values, and being open-minded, and giving people the benefit of the doubt, showing different viewpoints. And in this case, I think for many of us, we want to blame young people for accepting misinformation as fact. And I'm giving a more open-minded view by giving a bit of a contrast here, by saying that social media definitely plays a role in misleading people. And they often don't know how that even happens. And so that's why I'm showing a little bit of dichotomy here in introducing this quote to show a little bit of fairness in presenting this quote without being unfair. Now this one you might have to rewind a couple of times, and you might encounter this. Any quote that is 5 lines or longer when you type it in your essay, 5 lines or longer, has to be reformatted as a long quote. And notice that you have to indent this 2 times so that it does not line up with the indentation of a paragraph. Notice that long quotes do not have quote marks, that the period is here and not at the end of the citation, and that any quotes that you were quoting from the actual article that use quote marks in the article maintain intact, since we aren't using quote marks for the long quotes. Different from quote within a quote. Okay, so also notice that when you're continuing your explanation of the quote, you go all the way to the left margin because we're still on that same paragraph. You're not indenting here. And your explanation should be longer than the long quote. So you should not be using a long quote to kind of take up space in your essay, and then you have like a tiny one sentence, one liner to explain it. You really want a good analysis, picking out several parts of the long quote to analyze. And that's what's going to make it much longer than the long quote, if not the same length. Take time on this handout, review it, look at the long quote, and obviously this would all be double spaced. I just didn't have the space on the slide. Couple special punctuation cases. In this case, I could quote from here on, do I discern bias here? And this actually came from a quote in an article. So I would quote the selection and then a single quote where the quote mark is in the article. My goodness, you better pay attention to that. Quotes within quotes. But here, the selection I took from the article is already a question. And so that punctuation stays intact because this is already a question. Whereas here, I'm creating a question using the quote as part of that question. So in this case, I'm asking, Is it fair that people often teach news literacy through a negative lens? And I'm making that a question. So here the question mark goes at the end because it's not a question that's formulated that I copy and pasted. This is an actual question in the article. This is me using a quote to create a question. So that's a little different. You know, all I gotta say is you gotta take a stab at it. It's your draft. You're gonna mess up, and that's perfectly okay. But try these examples out if you can. Follow along with what I did. Try to emulate it in your writing. And if you mess up or you're not sure, talk to me, talk to a writing tutor. We're willing to help you figure out how to integrate these quotes. You're using your outline and all those quotes you found, and now it's time to take that draft and integrate these quotes into your paper. And these are all different ways to introduce quotes and how to make sure you're citing them properly to avoid plagiarism. Thank you so much for watching this very long video. I hope you paused it if you needed to, take good notes, rewind it if you have to, watch it over again, strongly suggest it, and review that handout occasionally and make sure you understand all the differences of how I made these quotes. Thanks so much for watching.